For decades, the political machinery of Washington has operated on a foundational, unspoken truth. Hillary Clinton has survived every grueling hearing, outlasted every sprawling investigation, and navigated every treacherous scandal that this unforgiving town has ever thrown at her. She has endured 8 separate, exhaustive inquiries, sat under the glaring congressional lights for 11 grueling hours of uninterrupted testimony, weathered the political firestorm of 33,000 deleted emails, and emerged from the wreckage without a single visible scratch on her. That era of impenetrable political armor, however, abruptly and catastrophically ended this morning. What you are about to witness, laid bare in the unforgiving lens of live television, is exactly what happens when a seasoned senator from Louisiana walks into a suffocatingly tense hearing room armed with nothing but a seemingly ordinary folder, and what lies waiting inside that unremarkable folder is an email that Hillary Clinton systematically deleted 8 long years ago, an incriminating digital ghost she confidently thought was eradicated and gone forever, which he then proceeds to read out loud on live television directly to her face. She has notably not made a single public statement since this devastating confrontation unfolded. You must stay focused and watch this meticulously until the very end, because this particular political reckoning carries unprecedented, earth-shattering consequences. When she first entered the sprawling chamber, she sat in the witness chair with the absolute, unquestioned authority of a person settling into a chair they personally own, appearing entirely settled, remarkably unhurried, with her customary water glass already poured and precisely placed before the committee chairman had even finished his obligatory introduction. She had occupied the center of this very room before, sitting in leather chairs, exactly like this one far more times than the vast majority of the adversarial senators seated across from her had even been in elected office, and she carried that heavy, documented history the way old money carries an aristocratic name lightly, visibly, effortlessly, and without ever needing to explicitly mention it. I want to say something before we begin. Hillary Clinton firmly stated, and her famously controlled voice possessed that particular, unmistakable steadiness, the exact calibrated tone she historically used in intimidating rooms filled with flashing cameras, the precise vocal frequency that cost her nothing, gave absolutely nothing away to her opponents, and efficiently filled the stifling air the way a mechanical thermostat fills a room evenly from all possible directions, firmly locked at a temperature she had unilaterally chosen. I have testified before this body for 11 hours, she declared, projecting a weary resilience. I have cooperated with 8 separate investigations. Every question that could be asked about Benghazi has been asked. Every answer I could give has been given. She then paused, executing the silence perfectly, deliberately pausing the exact way an impatient teacher pauses right before delivering the part of the tedious lesson she clearly considers entirely beneath the intellect of the class. I did everything I could with the information I had in the time I had it, she continued, cementing her defensive perimeter, and I have answered every question. So I am here today once more because that is what public servants do. We show up even when the show is a rerun. She sat under oath and audaciously just said she has answered every single question. Despite the glaring specter of 33,000 permanently deleted emails, she looked into the cameras and confidently declared she has answered every question. If you are inclined to blindly believe that carefully constructed narrative, you are free to keep scrolling past this broadcast. But if you don't, if you suspect there is a massive fracture in that polished facade, you need to stay right here and pay close attention. Across the polished mahogany divide, Senator John Kennedy sits holding a folder, and what is currently resting inside it is something she genuinely thought she had burned out of existence. Senator Kennedy deliberately leaned forward toward his waiting microphone in a cavernous committee room that was packed with anxious spectators well past the legal fire code. And he slowly folded his hands, resting on the heavy wooden table, executing the motion the specific way a humble man folds his hands in church, loosely, comfortably, but with the quiet, enduring patience still visibly resting within them. "I'm just a country lawyer, Mrs. Clinton," he began, his voice laced with a deceptive, slow-rolling Southern charm. "I went to some fine school, but I learned my trade in a courthouse in Zachary, Louisiana, where the air conditioning don't work and the judge has known you since you were in diapers." He let the rustic imagery settle over the highly sanitized Washington room before tightening the rhetorical net. "And, in a place like that, you learn to ask plain questions and expect plain answers. So I'm just going to ask you a few small things before we get into the folder, if that's all right." She stared back, offering nothing but stoic compliance. "Of course, Senator," she replied. Kennedy's eyes locked onto hers as he began laying the foundational traps. "Do you consider yourself an honest person?" he asked simply. "I do," she replied, without hesitation. "Do you believe the families of servicemen and women who die in the line of duty are owed the truth about how their loved ones died?" Kennedy pressed, his tone dropping in register. "Absolutely, without question," Clinton affirmed. "And would you agree that a government official who knowingly tells a grieving family a false story about how their child died, that is an unforgivable act?" Kennedy asked, securing the final conceptual pillar. "No one would disagree with that, Senator," she answered smoothly. Kennedy nodded slowly, visibly satisfied with the parameters they had just mutually established, and pushed his reading glasses down another millimeter on the bridge of his nose. "Good," he said softly. "I just wanted all of that on the record, because everything I'm about to show you, Mrs. Clinton, is going to be measured against what you just said." She did not visibly react to the escalating threat. She had absorbed sentences exactly like that one 100 different times from 100 different aggressive men in expensive suits, and she had systematically outlasted every single one of them. Kennedy then reached deliberately into the manila folder and extracted a single, solitary page. He performed the action without any theatrical flourish, pulling it out the mundane way you might take a crumpled receipt out of your worn wallet at a customer service return counter. There was absolutely no ceremony to the gesture, no manufactured weight to the moment. It was just a quiet man holding a flimsy piece of paper that coincidentally happened to have somebody else's damning words printed on it. He lowered his eyes and read it privately to himself first, subtly moving his lips, deliberately taking his absolute time, as if he intimately wanted to make certain he wasn't about to embarrassingly mispronounce something sensitive in front of esteemed company. And the entire breathless room sat paralyzed and watched him read in silence, because there is something profoundly unsettling about watching a person read silently to themselves in a fully packed room. It steadily builds a unique kind of atmospheric pressure that you simply cannot ever build by aggressively shouting. Shouting merely lets the opposition mentally brace themselves for impact, whereas reading silently, violently, forces them to lean in, vulnerable and exposed. Night of the 11th of September 2012, he finally said, his voice piercing the heavy quiet, "You put out a statement, Mrs. Clinton, official statement, your name on it, State Department seal on it, and in that statement you told the American people that the attack on our compound in Benghazi was a response to, and I'm reading your exact words here, inflammatory material posted on the internet." He methodically set the printed page perfectly flat on the dark table and smoothed out the imperceptible wrinkles once with the heavy side of his hand. "A video," Kennedy stated flatly. "You told this country a YouTube video killed 4 Americans." He let that brutal summation sit suspended in the electrified air. He didn't wait excessively long, just exactly long enough for the gravity of the sentence to fully traverse the room and violently strike the back wall. Now, he reached back into the depth of the folder and brought out a second page. And here, in this microscopic moment, was where his hands performed a small, seemingly insignificant thing that the astute observers sitting paralyzed in the front rows would vividly remember forever. He held the two distinct pages physically apart, gripping one in each hand, and he stared at them critically, examining them the precise way an indecisive man looks at two nearly identical paint chips at the local hardware store, intensely trying to figure out which exact shade of reality he's actually living with. Same night, same you. Few hours later, you sent an email to your daughter, Chelsea, Kennedy revealed, his rhythm accelerating. And in that email, you wrote your words, Mrs. Clinton, not mine, not a talk show host, not a Republican's, yours. That two officers were killed by, quote, an Al-Qaeda-like group. He then laid the second page deliberately beside the first, meticulously squaring the sharp edges with his fingertips to ensure perfect alignment. So America got the video, and Chelsea got Al-Qaeda. Kennedy summarized with lethal precision. Same night, same building, same woman. He slowly looked up, peering intensely over the thick rims of his glasses, his movement slow and calculated, mimicking the way a cautious man stops and checks on a volatile dog that has suddenly gone far too quiet in another room. I'm no diplomat, Mrs. Clinton, he drawled, weaponizing his folksy persona. I wouldn't know a talking point from a fence post. But where I come from, when a person tells one story to strangers and a completely different story to family, we got a word for that, and it ain't fog of war. He wasn't even close to being done. He reached in and brought out a third page, revealing it to be a classified transcript of a highly sensitive phone call that occurred the very next morning between Clinton and the Egyptian Prime Minister. He read the transcript's damning line aloud. We know the attack in Libya had nothing to do with the film. It was a planned attack, not a protest. Egypt, Kennedy said, the sheer absurdity hanging in his voice. You told Egypt the unvarnished truth the next morning on the telephone between allies, and yet, for the next 2 agonizing weeks, the weeping mothers and the grieving fathers and the traumatized friends of the 4 dead men who died defending that compound, they got the video. They got a fairy tale. He sharply tapped the Chelsea email once with his index finger. Cairo got this, he declared. He forcefully tapped the official public statement. The coffins got that. At that exact moment, a visibly shaken woman sitting in the 3rd row of the gallery unconsciously put her trembling hand flat against her own chest, doing it the instinctual way a terrified person does when something heavy and sharp unexpectedly lands in a vulnerable place they didn't properly protect. Mrs. Clinton, Kennedy asked, his voice tightening, did you tell Patricia Smith, the weeping mother of Sean Smith, while standing over the flag-draped casket of her deceased son on the cold tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base, that a video killed her boy? Clinton's hand instinctively moved toward her familiar water glass, lightly touched the condensation on the rim, and carefully returned to rest on the table. Senator, I express my deepest condolences to every grieving family, she answered, her voice an impenetrable fortress. I shared the best possible information that was available to us at that specific time. People undeniably hear many different things in overwhelming moments of enormous grief, and I would never presume to publicly question a grieving mother's fragile memory. Kennedy absorbed the deflection and immediately struck back. So the grieving mother miraculously heard wrong, Kennedy stated, his sarcasm biting through the tension. And your daughter heard perfectly right, and the Egyptian Prime Minister heard perfectly right. Just the heartbroken mothers somehow heard wrong. The massive industrial air conditioning unit clicked off somewhere high above the ornate ceiling, and then loudly clicked back on again. And in that infinitesimal agonizing half-second gap between those two mechanical sounds, the packed room held a suffocating silence that possessed an undeniable, crushing physical weight to it. The blunt truth came out while you were in your pajamas, Mrs. Clinton, Kennedy noted with surgical cruelty. The calculated lie came out officially typed on your State Department letterhead. And I sincerely think, if we're being completely honest with each other for the very first time today, that glaring discrepancy tells the entire tragic story right there. Clinton physically straightened her spine, bracing for the onslaught. The microphone was obviously already perfectly positioned exactly where she wanted it. She had meticulously placed it with practiced precision before the hearing even officially began, and she spoke now in the fiercely even, painstakingly measured cadence that had successfully carried her safely through 100 different hostile rooms, significantly hotter and more dangerous than this one. Senator, I genuinely appreciate you reading those historical documents into the congressional record, she parried. I've obviously seen them before. The intelligence community's fluid assessment naturally evolved over the chaotic course of those frantic 72 hours, precisely as complex assessments always do in every unpredictable crisis. The initial raw reporting strongly suggested a direct connection to massive protests sweeping across the region. The private email to my daughter simply reflected a very preliminary, uncorroborated report that had not yet been fully verified. I firmly acted in both distinct cases on the absolute best information available to me at the exact time of each separate communication. She paused, and the calculated pause was flawlessly calibrated to a precise quarter beat, just enough engineered silence to clearly signal to the room that what immediately followed was the most intellectually important part of her defense. That is emphatically not a contradiction, Senator, she declared with icy authority. That is exactly how national security practically works in real time. It operates not with the comfortable luxury of historical hindsight, but inherently with deeply imperfect information and the staggering, inescapable obligation to act decisively on it. A few frantic pens simultaneously started rapidly moving across notepads on the crowded press row, documenting the textbook deflection. Kennedy patiently let her fully finish. He intentionally let the tense air completely settle around her polished answer, letting the moment hang the exact way thick dust slowly settles after a massive truck violently goes tearing by on a dirt road, and then, with devastating calm, he uttered one single fatal sentence, and every pen in the press row instantly stopped moving. I understand the complex fog of war, Mrs. Clinton, I truly do, he conceded, but the fog of war don't ever explain how the absolute truth comfortably got on a secure plane to Cairo, while the fabricated lie went straight to the military coffins. Now, an undeniable shift occurred. Mrs. Clinton, Kennedy continued, his voice had not physically changed in its decibel volume, but something fundamental in its deep register had dangerously shifted, and the terrified people who had intently watched him professionally work witnesses before could instantly hear it. It was the distinct, terrifying sound of a heavy gear aggressively engaging behind the slow southern drawl, the massive engine finally catching and roaring to life. You boldly told this esteemed body, while sitting under federal oath, that the staggering 33,000 emails you intentionally deleted from your illicit private server were strictly personal in nature. You claimed they were yoga schedules, casual wedding planning, Chelsea's private dress fittings. He deliberately looked up, his eyes narrowing into slits. Your highly paid attorneys made that final determination. Not the FBI, not the independent inspector general, your private attorneys, the deeply conflicted people currently sitting on your exorbitant payroll. That is correct, Clinton replied, maintaining her rigid posture. They were comprehensively reviewed and firmly determined to be exclusively personal by your people, by your qualified counsel, Kennedy clarified. Yes, she confirmed. Kennedy slowly reached down into the folder and brought out a brand new page. It visually looked distinctly different from all the others. It was printed on different, heavier stock, featured a different institutional header, bore a glaring official seal stamped at the top, and slashed across the upper right corner in small, aggressive red type were two devastating words that the frantic television cameras in the crowded back row immediately zoomed in on before Kennedy even had the chance to read them. Recently declassified, Mrs. Clinton. I'm going to read you an internal email that was painstakingly recovered by the FBI forensic tech team from a hidden backup server your people completely did not know existed, Kennedy announced, his voice slicing through the room. It was buried deep in the massive batch you intentionally deleted. It was absolutely not about morning yoga. He comfortably settled his glasses back onto his face and began to read. The entire room collectively did not dare breathe. The hidden email was dated the 22nd of August, 2012, Kennedy read aloud. Exactly 3 weeks before the deadly attack, it was urgently sent from a desperate deputy assistant at the State Department, routed directly to Secretary Clinton's unauthorized personal server, entirely bypassing secure official channels. The terrified deputy explicitly described the rapidly deteriorating security situation on the ground in Benghazi. A fourth desperate request for urgently needed additional security personnel had been formally submitted and completely ignored. Two heavily armed local terrorist militias had been physically observed aggressively moving heavy military-grade weapons into tactical firing positions dangerously near the American compound. The chief regional security officer had formally filed a dire threat assessment, and the chilling final line right before the official signature read, Ambassador Stevens has personally expressed profound concern for his physical safety in writing. Awaiting your immediate guidance, Madam Secretary, Kennedy concluded. Kennedy deliberately let those desperate last four words hang suspended in the silent room, awaiting your guidance. Then, slowly, methodically, he turned the printed page completely over. And here is your exact reply. Mrs. Clinton, he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. 2 short lines. I'll read them both. He read them. We cannot publicly appear to be aggressively escalating. Redirect this request to the standard bureaucratic security review process. He paused, letting the bureaucratic dismissal sink in. And then the horrific second line, the only one that truly matters, Kennedy said, reading it incredibly slowly, keeping each individual word violently separate from the next, exactly like a mason methodically laying heavy, permanent bricks. Do not put this in the official channel. The folksy Louisiana charm instantly completely left his voice, then vanishing all at once, and what menacingly remained behind it was utterly flat, ruthlessly level, and possessed absolutely nothing warm or human in it at all. You didn't just bureaucratically ignore the desperate request, Mrs. Clinton, Kennedy accused, his eyes blazing. You maliciously told them to hide it, and then, when the time came, you deleted the damning email. And then you audaciously sat in front of this very body and confidently told us every single question had been truthfully answered. I have unequivocally never seen that fabricated document. Her voice shot back, coming incredibly fast, far too fast for a woman known for her icy control. The familiar, calculated hedging was completely gone. The complex 3-part sentence structures and the careful, lawyerly calibration vanished, replaced by just 5 flat, desperate words. I question its authenticity entirely. It was pulled directly off your private server, ma'am, Kennedy countered immediately. The unsecured one sitting down in your basement in Chappaqua, New York. The FBI forensic tech team perfectly matched the internal metadata directly to your personal mobile device. You personally typed and wrote it at 11:47 p.m. Eastern Time on a quiet Tuesday night from the comfort of your own home, exactly 3 weeks before 4 brave men violently died trapped inside the burning building you explicitly refused to protect. He forcefully set the damning page down directly in front of her, deliberately not sliding it casually across the polished wood, but aggressively placing it with absolute terrifying precision, the exact intimidating way a prosecutor silently lays a fatal piece of physical evidence on a table in a tense courtroom, deliberately keeping the damning text facing the doomed defendant. That's not a rogue staffer making a mistake, Mrs. Clinton. Kennedy spat. That's you, sitting safe at home, coldly telling a terrified man who was literally begging for his life to put his desperate begging somewhere nobody would ever find it. A horrified man, sitting rigidly 3 rows back in the packed public gallery, whispered Jesus Christ down into his own starched collar, not speaking to anyone in particular, just praying to the empty air. 3 weeks. She explicitly knew the dire threat a full 3 weeks before they burned and died. She actively ordered them to maliciously bury the urgent request for survival. And then she meticulously deleted the digital email, trying to erase history. If you, the viewer watching this broadcast right now, have ever proudly served this great country in uniform or deeply loved someone who bravely has, you need to urgently hit that subscribe button right now to demand accountability, because Senator Kennedy still has one more devastating email to reveal, the final apocalyptic one. And when you finally hear what this woman casually wrote while brave Tyrone Woods was literally bleeding out and dying on a compromised rooftop, you will instantly understand exactly why she desperately smashed her private phones with heavy hammers. This is a complete fabrication. Her voice suddenly found its lost footing again, or at least the desperate memory of its previous footing, and she aggressively pulled the long microphone a frantic 1/4 inch closer to her mouth. This partisan committee has obsessively spent years and blown millions of taxpayer dollars desperately trying to maliciously manufacture non-existent evidence that simply does not exist. I sat patiently for 11 hours, Senator. 11. 8 separate, exhaustive investigations thoroughly cleared me of any alleged wrongdoing. And now, remarkably conveniently, a miraculously newly recovered mysterious document suddenly appears out of thin air that perfectly says exactly what my political opponents have desperately wished it said for an entire decade. This is absolutely not congressional oversight. This is nothing but weaponized opposition research openly performed with a government gavel. It was, to her credit, a phenomenally real, fiercely delivered answer. It possessed genuine rhetorical muscle in it. A frantic reporter seated near the crowded aisle aggressively wrote something down extremely fast, and a loyal Democratic senator sitting just 2 seats down quietly tapped the heavy wooden table once with 2 supportive fingers. It was absolutely not open applause, but it was visually close enough to clearly see from the elevated gallery above. Kennedy patiently waited for the supportive tap to completely finish echoing through the cavernous chamber. Then 8 investigations. Mrs. Clinton, you are entirely right, Kennedy conceded darkly. And in every single solitary one of those compromised investigations, you absolutely controlled exactly which sanitized emails they ever got to see. You unilaterally decided what was casually personal and what was critical government business. You arrogantly decided what got generously handed over to the authorities and what got maliciously bleached with sophisticated military-grade software specifically designed to ruthlessly make sure God himself couldn't ever read it. He folded his large hands together. For the very first time in the entire dark history of this sorry, tragic mess, we finally have the specific ones you intentionally chose to desperately hide. And I completely understand exactly why you'd much rather angrily talk about the flawed investigative process than the actual contents of the damning email. I certainly would too, if I were unfortunately sitting in your chair. She had seamlessly delivered this exact procedural defense countless times before in much smaller rooms that mattered significantly less, and it had flawlessly worked every single time, functioning exactly the way a bright red fire exit works perfectly every single time. Right up until the catastrophic night, the dark hallway directly behind it is entirely engulfed in raging fire. Kennedy slowly reached into the depleted manila folder one final historic time. He carefully brought out the last remaining page, gripping it tightly with both hands, utilizing both hands for the very first time all grueling morning, and he physically held it up the careful way you hold a fragile thing that is significantly heavier and more dangerous than it visibly looks. This is the final one, he said grimly. One more single page, and I am completely done. He slowly read it, and the very molecular structure of the room permanently changed. The recovered email was sent directly from Clinton's unauthorized personal account. It was urgently sent exactly 4 agonizing hours after the brutal Benghazi terrorist attack officially began. 2 brave Americans were already lying dead. 2 more desperate men were brutally fighting for their lives at the besieged CIA annex, just a bloody mile away. The diplomatic compound was completely burning to the ground, and yet the recipient of this urgent midnight email was absolutely not a frantic government official, nor a military commander. It was sent to a massive, wealthy, major donor to the controversial Clinton Foundation, a deeply connected man possessing lucrative business interests firmly entrenched in Libyan reconstruction infrastructure contracts. And shockingly, the horrific email did not discuss the terrifying ongoing attack in any capacity. It categorically did not discuss frantic rescue efforts or emergency military deployments or the survival of the 2 desperate men who were at that exact moment still barely alive, pinned down on a flaming rooftop. It coldly discussed financial timelines. Kennedy read the horrific lines aloud in a voice so incredibly quiet and strained that a shocked man sitting in the 4th row actually cupped his shaking hand behind his ear just to hear the betrayal. Libya's volatile situation is inevitably going to severely complicate the agreed timeline, Kennedy read. We urgently need to proactively manage the media narrative before his financial people get overly nervous. Can you discreetly reach out and firmly assure them the lucrative project is definitively still on track, entirely separate from whatever official public response we are forced to put out tomorrow? He gently set the damning page down on the table. He did not utter a single spoken word for an agonizingly long time. 10 full seconds slowly passed. 15. The cheap fluorescent lights suspended above the elevated dais loudly hummed at a strange, annoying frequency that absolutely nobody in the room had ever consciously noticed before. It was a thin, sickly whine, exactly like the unsettling sound you hear echoing in an empty, sterile hospital corridor very late at night. Someone terrified in the quiet gallery nervously swallowed hard, and the highly sensitive microphone positioned nearest to them aggressively picked it up, broadcasting a small, wet click that sharply traveled through the massive speakers and abruptly died. Tyrone Woods was still fighting and alive when you coldly wrote that email. Mrs. Clinton, Kennedy's voice was barely registering above the sickly hum of the fluorescent lights. He was trapped on the exposed roof of the CIA annex, desperately firing a heavy machine gun. He had already been brutally fighting for his life for 4 horrific hours. He would bravely continue to fight against the odds for 7 more agonizing hours before a devastating enemy mortar round finally landed directly on him, ending his life. And in those exact same desperate hours, the very hours he was trapped up on that bloody roof, violently dying for this grateful country, you were sitting comfortably inside your luxurious house, securely logging onto your illicit private server, explicitly writing to a wealthy man who writes massive checks about exactly how to keep a lucrative backroom business deal smoothly on track. And exactly here, emerging from the very front row of the paralyzed public gallery, a grieving woman slowly stood up. She executed the movement incredibly slowly, rising with a heavy, solemn dignity, the exact way heartbroken people stand up in a quiet church when the sacred name of the recently dead is finally read aloud. She was entirely draped in mourning black. She was tightly holding a small, intimately framed photograph pressed hard against her own chest. It was a picture of a handsome young man standing proudly in immaculate marine dress blues, flashing a bright, smiling face, the specific kind of innocent, invincible smile that exclusively belongs to a hopeful person who is only 23 years old and blissfully does not yet know the absolute horrors of what is rapidly coming for him. She deliberately did not raise the framed photograph high into the air like a political prop. She firmly held it exactly where it currently was, resting at the absolute center of her fragile body, positioned exactly where, if Hillary Clinton simply dared to look straight ahead, looking directly past Kennedy and past the flashing cameras, she would unavoidably have to see it. Hillary Clinton resolutely did not look. You famously asked this grieving country once before, Kennedy powerfully reminded the room. What difference at this point does it make? He aggressively slammed his index finger down onto the donor email resting on the table. I'll forcefully tell you exactly what difference it makes, Mrs. Clinton Kennedy practically growled. It makes four dead men. That is the exact bloody difference it makes. Kennedy then physically stood up from his leather chair. It was the only time all exhaustive morning he had physically left his fortified position, and the massive room instantly registered the dramatic shift. Reacting the exact instinctual way a crowded room physically registers a powerful judge unexpectedly entering, causing a sudden, undeniable shift in atmospheric gravity, prompting a wave of collective, nervous straightening of spines. He slowly, methodically walked the entire length of the long mahogany table, and as he deliberately passed each damning printed page he had systematically laid out over the grueling course of the morning hearing, he gently touched it with one single finger, pressing lightly, replicating the exact methodical way a tired man touches a wooden fence post as he carefully walks a disputed property line, silently counting his losses. September 11th, 10 p.m., he recounted, you secretly emailed Chelsea it was Al-Qaeda. Touch, September 11th, 10:30. You blatantly told America it was just a video. Touch, September 12th, you confidentially told Egypt it was absolutely not the video. Touch, August 22nd. Your desperate deputy begged for security help. You coldly said, bury it. Touch. September 11th, 4 hours into the deadly siege, Tyrone Woods is trapped on a burning rooftop. You corruptly wrote a wealthy donor about a lucrative business deal. Touch. He slowly turned his body around. He stared directly at her, sitting isolated across the incredibly long table, staring fiercely across the dividing white line of damning printed pages separating them. And then you maliciously deleted every single one of these desperate warnings. You ruthlessly bleached the illicit server. You aggressively smashed the mobile phones into pieces with heavy hammers. And you confidently sat in front of this esteemed body and you looked directly at the devastated families who violently lost absolutely everything they loved, and you arrogantly said, what difference does it make? He slowly walked back to his empty leather chair. He purposefully did not sit back down. He, imposing, stood rigidly behind it, gripping his hands tightly on the high back of it. I'll tell you the real difference. Mrs. Clinton, Kennedy declared, delivering the final lethal blow. You maliciously lied to grieving mothers sobbing over flag-draped caskets. You corruptly buried the desperate warning that absolutely could have easily saved 4 brave American lives. And when their broken bodies finally came flying home, packed in heavy wooden boxes draped with sacred flags you most certainly did not earn, you proudly stood on the cold tarmac and shamelessly lied to the world about exactly why they were dead. And then you went comfortably home to the luxurious house with the hidden server humming in the dark basement, and you systematically deleted the absolute proof, every single damning piece of it. He slowly took off his reading glasses, meticulously folded the arms inward, and gently set them down on the hard table right beside the final devastating page, and the tiny, sharp metallic click of the tiny hinges loudly carried perfectly in the absolute deathly quiet of the paralyzed room. You didn't accidentally misspeak, Mrs. Clinton, Kennedy concluded with terrifying finality. You didn't simply misremember the chaotic events. You just finally got caught. He let the accusation bleed into the silence. And the 4 brave men you coldly left to die on that burning compound. Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, Glenn Doherty. They tragically can't ever speak for themselves anymore. They will violently never be able to speak for themselves ever again. But these printed pages finally speak for them. And what these pages loudly say is exactly what those betrayed men would scream if they miraculously still had voices to use. His own deep voice dramatically dropped to something so incredibly quiet it was barely audible to the human ear, and the entire packed room subconsciously leaned dangerously forward, straining to physically meet it. You explicitly knew the deadly threat, and you coldly let it happen anyway, and then you shamelessly lied to the world about why Hillary Clinton's legendary impenetrable composure completely shattered the exact moment her trembling right hand hovered paralyzed over her water glass, inexplicably freezing in midair before she violently slammed both palms flat onto the polished mahogany table, her nail beds turning a sickly white as if desperately trying to anchor the room from spinning entirely out of control. When the committee chairman formally requested her response to the staggering allegations, the agonizing silence that followed stretched into an eternity, broken only by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and her fractured mechanical gasp of, "I have answered every question that has ever been asked of me." The words landed with the tragic cadence of a dying clock, prompting Senator Kennedy to deliver the fatal, devastatingly gentle blow. "No, ma'am, you truthfully answered every question you personally chose to answer." The hidden emails finally answered all the rest. Before the gavel even formally fell to adjourn the explosive hearing, a flawlessly cut 90-second clip dubbed "The 4 Dead" was completely set loose on the internet, capturing Kennedy coldly reading the horrifying donor email juxtaposed with Clinton's paralyzed stare and a grieving mother draped in black holding her dead son's photograph, instantly amassing an unprecedented 40 million views and irrevocably shifting Washington's tectonic plates. The absolute first political domino fell at exactly 4:17 p.m. when a powerful Democratic committee chair and former staunch ally publicly demanded a formal Department of Justice inquiry, a devastating defection that triggered a rapid cascade of similar condemnations from 4 other leading Democrats and forced the panicked DOJ to officially announce an active review of the recovered materials, a terrifying Washington code word for an impending grand jury investigation. By the time a highly respected former federal prosecutor declared on live national television that she was facing catastrophic criminal exposure, ranging from felony perjury to blatant obstruction of justice, Clinton's famously aggressive PR machine had gone unprecedentedly, deafeningly dark. while the heartbroken mother quietly traced her fallen son's name on a bronze State Department memorial wall and walked away into the fading sun, Senator Kennedy placed a solemn phone call from his town car to Patricia Smith, who tearfully whispered into the receiver that her boy could finally rest now that the truth was out. Yet an entirely different, frantic scene was violently unfolding deep inside a fortified Chappaqua mansion, where every single light was blazing at midnight as the most calculated woman in American political history furiously paced the floors, desperately working the phones only to be met with dead air and the chilling realization that the digital ghost of her bleached basement server had fully returned to exact its absolute vengeance. 4 brave American heroes, Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, and Glenn Doherty, violently died in Benghazi while she coldly managed a financial narrative. And if you fiercely believe their profound sacrifice demands unyielding justice rather than a dismissive shrug, you must hit subscribe immediately, share this broadcast everywhere, and leave their names in the comments below. Because as the lights continue to burn furiously inside that Chappaqua estate and her protective political walls rapidly collapse into dust, federal prosecutors are already quietly gathering in a secure DOJ war room, meticulously reviewing the newly authenticated metadata, leaving an entire paralyzed nation holding its collective breath, agonizingly waiting to see exactly who the FBI will officially send knocking on her front door when the sun finally rises tomorrow morning.